It's a pleasure to talk with you. I was going over your websites today, and you've got some phenomenal research and investigations into near-death experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in this?
Sure. I was a critical care physician for the first part of my career, and I was out of Seattle Children's Hospital. I worked for what's known as Airlift Northwest, and Airlift Northwest is, as you might imagine, is an air transport service through Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and to bring critically ill children to Seattle Children's Hospital. So I happened to pick up a young girl in Pocatello, Idaho, and she was a very, very difficult resuscitation. Several times I thought that she was, in fact, dead. And her parents, in fact, had insisted on coming in and praying at her bedside and forming sort of a prayer ring around her, which was very inconvenient for us because, of course, we're trying to put all kinds of tubes and lines in her. But I figured that she was, really, her demise was going to be within minutes, so I let them. But to my surprise, she made a full recovery. And as one of these things happens in life, sort of a coincidence, I happened to be out there in Pocatello working, doing some residency training in a little clinic there. And she happened to be, she came into that clinic for her follow-up after her successful recovery. And she looks at me and she goes, "Oh, there's the guy that put a tube in my nose."
Wow.
I was like, "Well, what?" Because when I had seen her, of course, she wasn't seeing anything. Her eyes were fixed and dilated, and she was, well, we tape our eyes closed anyway in those situations because we don't want, dust or dirt to fall in them. But, I knew that she had not, in fact, seen me do anything. And she went on to say things like, little comments that the nurses has made. And then she said, "Oh, I saw you go over to the phone, and you were talking to someone on the phone, and you were sort of shouting at them, saying, well, what am I supposed to do now?" Which, in fact, was what I was doing, because I sort of, I didn't know, what to do next in terms of her resuscitation. And she gave blow-by-blow details of her own resuscitation. And at the time, I was training to be a neurologist. And interestingly enough, the spiritual aspects of her experience really had very little interest for me. I was mostly interested that she could remember anything, that she could, in fact, describe her own resuscitation. And
how many of these
results to study this?
You've documented many of these instances. Was it something that, when you encountered her story, did it immediately start ringing bells in your head that there's something else out there? Because I read a story of yours where you were talking about joking with other doctors as you were, I believe, performing CPR on a baby or trying to resuscitate a child. And it didn't shock me when I read that because I've got family there in the medical field, and it's somewhat common that, I guess, to make a light of the situation or to make it easier to accept, that a lot of medical professionals end up almost in a very callous nature in regards to a situation like that. It wasn't just this one event. How many do you think overall, before you started going, wait a second, there's something here?
Well, it wasn't. I don't think that was really the sequence. I haven't really thought that there was something here, as you put it. That took me many, many years to reach that realization. What really interested me first was this concept of that she could retain a memory at all. And so I immediately, I was just starting in medicine. I was a resident at the time. So I was, I wanted to make my mark in the world. And I immediately set out to do a study of these experiences. And at the time, nobody had really studied these experiences in any sort of formal or systematic way. There was a number of sort of collections of stories in adults, But at Seattle Children's Hospital, we decided that we would, at the time, actually, we thought that a anesthetic agent called halothane caused these experiences. Halothane is known to sort of cause dissociative or out-of-body experiences, and we decided we would study them. So we studied all survivors of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital over about 10 years. And then it's over that 10-year period, I mean, that it just sort of starts creeping up on you. I resuscitated one child. He was resuscitated in the lobby of Seattle Children's Hospital. He had a cardiac arrest because his pacemaker failed. And so we resuscitated him right in the lobby and got his pacemaker going again. And he opens his eyes and he looks at me and he goes, "That was weird. You guys just sucked me back into my body."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I mean, it's but I understand this sort of skeptical viewpoint, or people that really dismiss these experiences out of hand, or really, it doesn't resonate with them. Because I had that myself. I mean, it's very, very difficult, because we're trained, of course, to think that the brain creates consciousness. And I think one advantage that I have, these are by and large patients I resuscitated myself. So I knew for a fact that their brains weren't working. Whereas, when other people, when you read about these stories, or, you just really wonder, well, were they really close to death? Or, are they just kind of exaggerating things? Or, or if you go through the medical records, it's very hard sometimes to tell if somebody's really near death or not. Whereas the boy I was telling you about, I know, he was in full cardiac arrest. I mean, within minutes, he would have been dead. That's why we resuscitated him in the lobby of the, the Children's Hospital instead of taking him to the emergency room.
When you say they're dead, I mean, I guess a skeptic would say, oh, well, there must be some oxygen in the brain. There's still brain activity, but that's not the case. The brain is literally flatlined. Is that correct?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm going to just skip to the end of the story because I just think that I used to mince around like you're saying too. When we first published our studies, we would call them clinically dead, and then we would we just sort of hem and haw about it because again it defies what we're taught. I went to Johns Hopkins. I mean, the gods of neurology that I worship say that, the coma wipes clean the slate of consciousness. Dead brains don't think, in other words. But here's the end of the story. I'll just skip right to the end. In the last couple of years, astonishingly enough, science has found that there is a resting energy in the brain that far exceeds probably the entire energy output of the brain, during conscious life, and so they're really in the last couple of years, it's been well shown that the dying or dead brain has an enormous amount of resting activity. Physicians at George Washington University just recently showed that in the last few seconds of life, there's an enormous amount of coherent brain wave activity measured on EEGs. So I think we just, I don't think anybody feels good about it. I mean, unless you're already very religious. But I'm just saying, medical scientists, we don't feel good about it. But let's face it, these are dead brains, and yet they're still conscious, and they're awake, and they're alert, and they're having thoughts and feelings. And more importantly, the feelings they're having are primarily spiritual feelings and the belief that they're learning lessons of love. You can't get around it. That's a scientific statement in the year 2011, is that when we die, we're going to be awake and aware, and we're learning lessons of love. Let me just... I'm going to just give you, to show you how solid this science is. There's a guy named Jim Winery, who is a very good friend of mine. I worked with him for years, and he's a flight surgeon for the National Warfare Institute. and he inadvertently discovered an experimental model for near-death experiences. They took fighter pilots and they would put them in a centrifuge and whirl them at enormous speeds so they could understand the effect of G-forces on the human brain. And so, of course, he's able to, they can vary their centrifuge runs to, a couple of minutes before theoretical death, right on up to a couple of seconds before theoretical death. And sure enough, his research shows that in the last few seconds of life, really when the brain theoretically should be shutting down, it's not. It's those pilots then suddenly become awake and aware, and they think they're out of their body, and they're having a whole variety of near-death experiences. And quite frankly, This is after they've gone into coma. This is after they've had seizures. This is after they've had, a complete loss of, I mean, you can't. I don't think anybody can dispute anymore that in the last few minutes of life, a child told me best. She said, I was never so alive as in the few seconds before I died.
That's incredible. Let me ask you, your perception of Western medicine. I'm reading your work. You seem like you've moved away from the traditional constructs of Western medicine. Is that the case, or is Western medicine moving towards the research you're doing?
No, I think that I'm moving away from from traditional Western medicine. I want to say something though that I think is important. In no way am I saying that so-called Western medicine is wrong. I think that the new understandings that I've had, and frankly I think anybody involved in this field has had. We're not saying though that that pills don't work. Of course they work. Of course our bodies are biological machines. Of course we can tinker with the biological machine with various pills and things like that. But having said that, it's far more limited than we ever realized. That so much of medicine is in fact what people loosely call energetic medicine. It's really this idea that that we're just a biological machine. It doesn't do justice to what's going on during the healing process.
I agree.
We're just but it's not. The reason I'm emphasizing this is it really irritates me what I consider to be an unhealthy either-or attitude. Either you go see a naturopath or, you go see your regular doctor. I mean, I dream of, 20 years from now, all doctors having the same body of information and using it, the way it's supposed to be. I mean, medicine should be medicine.
I agree.
Sure, but having said that, I mean, we're doing a lot of research now in energetic medicine, and it's amazing to me that the sort of built-in prejudices against it, the built-in, just sort of the sweeping and the dismissive,
it's somewhat dismissed, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's ridiculous. Of course, it's true. This might sound like a weird jump to you, but it's not. So I'll fill in the gaps, but I'm going to do the jump first. When I wanted to understand if the near-death experience is real, so one thing that my wife and I learned to do was something called remote viewing. And the remote viewing is the ability to use your mind to see things that are not in your ordinary field of senses. Well, so that's important to me to understand near-death experiences, because the near-death experience is what we call a non-local perception. These children are describing another reality that is not, in fact, this reality. Well, so the question comes, is that other reality real? Is the God that they see a real God? Well, and I've been on enough of these debates to know that, that you always have some sort of mean-spirited materialist guy that always, it always does seem to be a guy, by the way. He always says, well, these are just hallucinations in the last few minutes of life and blah, blah, blah. Come on. So let's see, when we die, we hallucinate we're going to heaven, and we hallucinate we're learning beautiful stories of love, of how we could have lived our lives differently if only we had been more loving. Okay, well, sure. I mean, there's no way of arguing with that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if someone wants to, that's like saying, well, there's people that don't believe in love, period. That everything in life is an economic exchange, and I don't know. Anyway, but this controlled remote viewing did give us a chance to say, well, wait a minute, here's a non-ordinary perception that we can say if it's true or not, because, if we're going to see the Eiffel Tower, for example, in Paris, well, then, that's something objective, then we can see if we nailed it or not. Okay, anyway, all right, my wife and I learned to do that. It turns out it's true. Okay, with that, we do have this ability as human beings. But the point
and y'all actually teach it to people, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. You're right with me. I'm only so worried if I kind of jump around, but it's So
actually, to give you some background, information, we did have Paul Smith on the program.
Paul
Smith
is my teacher. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So
we're with you. So just go ahead and continue.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you some stuff then that Paul Smith doesn't even seem to know. It's great, and Paul Smith is the greatest. But here's sort of the punchline in terms of a physician, someone who's studying near-death experiences, trying to understand this stuff. Okay, because remember, we were starting to talk about energetic medicine and different ways of healing, etc. So as I got to know Paul Smith and got to know that whole culture, it became obvious to me that they have extraordinary abilities, that the United States has, in their psychic spy program, they can do amazing things. And, to not get real coy about it all, but to not beat around the bush either, the military remote viewers have earned every service award that's available to non-combat soldiers.
Wow, that's
and from 2 presidents, and from the Secret Service twice. So they're not getting those awards for nothing. And I'm thinking to myself, though, well, in the world of medicine, we have Reiki healers and we have energetic healers and things like that. But they don't really do very much. They're thought to perhaps, you can relieve stress, you can, simple things like that. But nobody is really, and of course you always hear some extraordinary story about someone being, being cured of cancer by a Reiki therapist. I have a story like that from my own practice, a small child that was healed by energetic healing. But my question is, if the regular world, the non-military world, if we took this stuff seriously, if we stopped with this dismissive attitude, oh, dead brains can't think, oh, those just must be hallucinations at the point of death, oh, energetic healing, that can't be true. I mean, if it doesn't come in a little pill box, and, then it can't actually work, as if those pills weren't first, herbs, that traditional or, healers used anyway.
Absolutely.
I mean, if we didn't have this attitude, if we had the attitude that Paul Smith has, we'd be using this kind of energetic healing on a regular basis. We would be actually putting this kind of knowledge to work. And I get, that's sort of, my soapbox and my beef about it all, is that once I learned that near-death experiences are real, sort of by the tangential way of learning about remote viewing, to me, remote viewing is a window into the near-death experience, to sort of just sum that up. Then I'm wondering.
Let me ask you. because you touched upon that, and I don't want to take you off your track, so if you could just make a mental note of where you're at. I have a question. This is an interactive format, how we do the show, and I've got a question from our shtf411.com chat. It is a question from a man named Von Hellman, and he wants to know on these people that have had the near-death experiences and see the light or other dead people on the other side. Do you follow up with them, and how has it affected their lives? And I want to turn that towards you, because you're saying that it's somewhat, with your remote viewing, that you think it's, or you know it's similar to a near-death experience. So could you kind of touch on how it's impacted those people and yourself, and if you stayed up with them?
Absolutely. Let me just, I just have one more sentence to finish up, because basically what I was trying to pull together was to just say, hey, wait a minute. If we took the near-death experience seriously, if we learn these lessons from the light, and if we learn the implications of what this experience is, and if we applied the same discipline and rigor that the United States military has applied to psychical experiences, we would see a revolution in medicine right now. We would, our medical knowledge would increase tenfold. So that's, and then that does fit very nicely into that question then of the transformation of the near-death experience. We did, in fact, I've studied these, since I studied these children back in the 1990s, we have continued to study them as years go by. In addition, I did a formal study of adults who had near-death experiences as children. And, to look at, whether or not it's really the near-death experience that seems to alter their lives. And in a nutshell, it does. And what they learn from this experience is to be nice, to be nice people. People that have had the near-death experience, first of all, their spirituality is very different than the spirituality that I sort of see, when I look around in the population. They, by and large, people have had near-death experiences. They see this life as the spiritual life. That we're supposed to learn something here, and primarily we're learning lessons of love, of how to love each other. So that's the main thing. And that they're not all about then wanting to leave their body and, have out-of-body experiences and things like that. One child told me best. She said that life is for living and the light is for later. So they have that, they've come back with a sense of purpose. But the purpose is to live this life. Or, another child told me, she said she sees pieces of the light everywhere she goes. She says, I don't mind waiting in line at the supermarket anymore, because I know the light is there. I know that around me, I can find it. So it's not. They by and large are not religious when they come back. If they were religious, they don't go to church anymore. By and large, they I wouldn't say they reject anything, but they sort of drop the whole concept of that God is one thing or another. And they come back with, we documented that they spend more time with their family. They spend more time giving money to charity. They typically work in helping professions. They spend more time in simple things like meditation. So the transformation, the mystery of life, the secret of life is actually pretty simple. It's, be a nice person, get along with your neighbor, try to be a loving person. And they don't come back with, wanting to, found some church or, proselytize to everybody at all. Not in the least. So it's kind of ironic. These are people who have actually seen God or, whatever God is. There's no doubt that, these are people who actually see, God, and yet they don't come back and then want to set up a church and teach everybody about God.
That's good. That's
tells
good.
You something right there.
Absolutely. It does, at least to me. It does. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'll just tell you one quick story. It was, this is a formal study that I did. I did a formal study of, the adults that had near-death experiences as children. So, of course, they have to fill out a questionnaire and, all this kind of stuff. They have to fill out, their address and what their occupation is and everything. So this young man, probably in his early 20s, he says to me that he was sent back. His experience was really funny, too. He was floating out of his body, and then he didn't know how he was going to get back in his body. So he had a terrible moment of panic. Yeah, people always talk about these experiences being so beautiful and everything, but weird is what children describe them as. And he said he had no idea how he was going to get back in his body, and he became very frightened and very upset. But then finally a voice seemed to say to him, "Go back, Bobby, you have a job to do." And almost picked him up by like the scruff of his neck and threw him back to his body, or is what he perceived it as already. So okay, so all right, so this is this is kind of early in my career too, and I was a little more cynical about all this stuff. I was like thinking, oh great, this is going to be the one. He's sent back to to I don't know, to find a cure for cancer or whatever. So I was like, I looked at him and I was practically rolling my eyes. I was like, okay, so what was the job? What were you sent back for? He looks at me and he says, "You know what my job is." And I was like, what are you talking about? I mean, come on, you just said you were sent back from heaven to do a job. He said, yeah, I told you I run a little construction company. I got those numbnuts working for me, and if it weren't for me, those guys would never find a job. Nobody would hire them.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, that was his whole perception. He was sent back to run this tiny, he had like 4 or 5 of his high school friends that worked for him.
Huh.
And that's a
incredible.
very, very typical attitude of people who've had near-death experiences. They feel that their ordinary lives are filled with purpose. I'll tell you another quick one. I'll just tell you really quick because this is a really important concept. Is that
please?
When people are struggling to understand all this, they that's the clock in my house. But this one guy, he said to me that he knows his life is important. So I said, well, how do you know that? He said, well, I don't know. Maybe my life isn't important. But maybe I'll talk to somebody, and then they'll do something, and then that'll cause somebody else to do something important. Or maybe it'll just be I'm walking across the street one day, and a car will slow down, and that'll do something so that someone else doesn't get run over. Yeah, so they have this sense of this greater interconnectedness, and yet, they feel their lives are important. They don't have a sense like the rest of us, and, we're all just, dung beetles on Earth that are just going to die, and there's, 5 billion of us, and what does it matter if we live or die? That is not their attitude.
It almost sounds like they have when they come back, they have almost a butterfly type effect feeling about themselves. They're not looking to change the world single-handedly. They're just looking to give a nudge almost. Would you say that's correct?
Absolutely. That is well said. That's perfectly, that makes me wonder if you've had a near-death experience. That's just the kind of thing that they say. Precisely. They talk that all of life is interconnected, that life is one big pattern, and that anything that one person does is just going to sort of vibrate through the whole, network. There's just all one big, Well, they talk a lot. You had Paul Smith on your show. They talk a lot like Paul Smith, that sort of concept that this is all just a big matrix, and that, everything is all connected for a reason. And in this world, we don't know what the reason is, but that, when they're in that moment, they feel they know everything. They feel that they have, a sense of complete knowledge, which is, of course...
Paul was great, by the way.
Yeah. Well, that's why. See, that's why I say that the near-death experience, that the controlled remote viewing is a window into the experience. Because if it's true that that during the near-death experience you enter into this state of all knowledge, well, then it makes sense that somebody who's interested in a military target across the world could come back with that piece of knowledge. I mean, that all the knowledge is there, and that you can come out with whatever knowledge you feel is going to be useful to you.
Now,
and I think that's correct.
we've got an hour left of the show time, and I want to ask you right now. I've got a list of questions I want to get through, but at the same time, your stories in and of themselves are absolutely incredible. I'm asking you right now to consider coming back on the show at some future date, because I could do a whole show listening to you on your stories. They're just incredible.
Well, let me hear those questions, though, because really, I'm going to tell you what my motivation is. My motivation is a real simple one. I consider myself to be incredibly blessed and incredibly lucky. Very few, really, if anybody, that these are children that by and large I resuscitated myself. I was able to hear their stories for the first time, and as a physician. So that just, when I read about near-death experiences in the media, or, I see stuff on TV, etc., I just want to put my head in my hands, or some of these overly skeptical people, I see, even to my videos, sometimes, I have some videos on YouTube, and these people write in these comments. I just want to hug them, because, I can understand. I can understand if I hadn't, if I didn't resuscitate these children, if I didn't know that they were in fact dead, then I would be wondering about this whole deal too. Is it, somebody exaggerating the medical records? Are they? And there's aspects to the experience that. Here, I'll give you a story to illustrate what I'm saying. I resuscitated this young girl, and we had to put a needle in her heart to restart her heart. Okay, so that's that's near death. I mean, that's
absolutely.
That's not just near death. That's like
that's dead.
In 15 years of being a critical care physician, that only happened once, and it actually worked.
Wow.
So she comes, and so she tells me her story, and her story is that she can't remember anything about being in the hospital. She doesn't remember why she was in the hospital in the first place. Okay, well, that fits with conventional, neurology, that she's lost her short-term memory. So then she has this one isolated experience, and this experience is that she says, while I heard you asking for that crash cart thing, and the nurses were running around, and you were telling them you needed something, so she localizes when this happened to her. She says that she saw her grandmother sitting in a chair. And then she says, and I was back. So I said to her, well, what do you mean you're back? And she clenches her hands, and she goes, that's what I've been trying to figure out.
Wow.
Well, she never said that again. I never heard her say that again. By the time she said, discharged from the hospital, and she's home, and now she's told her story, and she's told her story on TV. Now it's the typical story. She went into a room, there was all these bright lights, her grandmother was sitting there, but and so and I think people quite naturally they start saying, well, wait a minute, is everybody just sort of embellishing these stories, etc.? But they're embellishing them out of the natural urge to try to explain something that's unexplainable. Once they start talking to other people, then of course these stories sort of become homogenized. But I was lucky enough to hear these stories for the first time, and they're not. She's like, that's what I'm trying to figure out. So if these are just an invention of the mind, she would have made it up right on the spot. Not making it up is the wrong word. We use the term confabulation when the brain tries to just paper over a memory gap. It's seamless. I've interviewed many patients, that have conditions that cause confabulation, and they seamlessly invent a story right from the start. Whereas her story evolved, just from the naturalness of, she's 8 years old, and now, everybody's telling her what it really was. But it doesn't evolve that much. She still has, she still says her grandmother was sitting in a chair and was dressed in white, etc. But I feel it's my responsibility to let people know. And also, all the parents whose children didn't come back. I mean, and they're so, and yet they've had profound spiritual experiences. And right now in our society, the way it is, our society is just like, a spiritual experience is just, a hallucination. It's just your mind trying to deal with grief or, all these kinds of, things.
Well, we're a society of consumerism and materialism. So let me ask you, with your work.
So there's a long way of saying, though, I want to answer your questions. Because I just feel like I have an obligation to answer them. I just, nobody else can answer them. I'll just tell you that much. I don't know that, so many of the other researchers are just not, I don't know. Anyway, Penn von Lommel, I think, there's a handful of us who actually resuscitated our own patients, but not many.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, with these questions, feel free to expand in the stories. I do want you on again. You've got some mind-blowing stories that I shouldn't say stories. I should say experiences, documented experiences. They're incredible. So as I go through these questions, feel free to just elaborate and just let me know when you're done with that, because
sure.
I am just blown away. Your main premise in doing the controlled remote viewing, and I think I may have missed it, but I'll just in a minute, if you would, with the controlled remote viewing, does it give you the near-death experience? And then on top of that, your purpose in doing the controlled remote viewing is to explore, as you stated, we're doing this controlled remote viewing to figure out military strategic targets and how to kill people, but you're actually looking at how to cure things such as AIDS, hepatitis, potentially see into patients that where other doctors can't figure out what's wrong with them, and to actually understand from this alter from within the matrix, understand what's wrong with them. So you're actually trying to do this stuff to create a literal shamanistic practice in the 21st century. 21st century version.
Hey, thanks. I've never heard it said that way, but you're right. I guess I've never actually considered it as you said, but that's correct. I believe that a remote viewing ultimately could become a shamanistic experience. That right now, I don't think we've gotten to that state yet. But you're right. I think that if in fact people really put their mind to it, and if we devoted the kind of resources to medical applications that the military has devoted to their purposes, intelligence gathering, etc., it could be a true shamanistic practice, and we would take medicine up another level. Sure, I agree with that. But tell me, your question itself, I know I gave a lot of information all at once, so I'm glad to just stop now and sort of go back over it. The controlled remote viewing is not the near-death experience. I don't mean to say that at all. The sequence went for me like this. My first question with near-death experiences is, when do they occur? And my research, Penn von Lommel's research, everybody's research indicates that they, in fact, occur in the last few minutes of life. So that's the first question. Okay. So, so then that, of course, brings up the question of, consciousness, and do we need a brain to have consciousness? So, sort of the second question is, what is the relationship between, the human brain and consciousness? And, so there's two sort of quick answers to that. One is about 1/4 of the human brain actually has the hardwired machinery in it to let us have a spiritual experience and to interact with a God. That's number one. And number two, I understand, believe me, I understand that this is in defiance of, modern neuroscience and what I learned in medical school and is still taught in medical school, but there's no doubt about it, is that memories are probably stored outside the brain, and consciousness does not depend on a functioning brain. Okay, so, but there still is a question that's left, is how do we know, though, that the experiences that these children have are real? I mean, they're saying that they see a real God, they're saying this, that, or the other, but is the information that they get out of the experience, can that information be relied on or trusted? So in other words, if an angel comes and says something to you and tells you something, is that useful information, or is that just a reflection of your own internal state? Well, that's a very, very important question, particularly if you're a grieving parent. Because if my child has died, and then I have the experience that my child has appeared at my bedside and is saying, "Stop crying, Mommy, I'm in heaven," well, we want to know, is that a true perception? Is that a child who really is in whatever, the heck heaven is? Or is that just a reflection of a grieving parent's internal state? So it was to answer that question that my wife and I learned controlled remote viewing, was because we wanted to know then is if when we, if we delve into this realm of universal knowledge, a realm, by the way, that the theoretical physicists tell us is real. I mean, our current mathematical model of reality, quantum physics, for the last 75 years, says that there is a all-knowledge, timeless, spaceless domain. And like I said, we've got about a fourth of our brain has the neurological machinery to interact with this experience, and dead brains seem to interact with this experience. But nevertheless, sure, it's such an overwhelming concept, and it's so in defiance of what we currently believe that that doesn't, all of those sort of circumstantial clues don't seem to be enough. So my wife and I, we wanted to see if it was true. Is it, because controlled remote viewing in itself, the scientific literature documenting that controlled remote viewing is real, I wouldn't say it's well accepted by the, I don't want to go into it. I mean, that's a whole show, and you've already done, but I'll just say that my wife and I decided the only way we're going to be able to sift through all this confusing and conflicting information on remote viewing is just to learn it ourselves. So I've been down to, Paul Smith, taken his course. I've taken Lynn Buchanan's course, and we spent the last couple of years, and sure enough, yes, remote viewing is real. And so to me then, if remote viewing is real, then there's no reason to believe that all of it isn't real. If I can slip into this God's mind, whatever God is, if I can slip into this world of universal knowledge and I can come out with information that can then be objectively verified, as you know, and the listeners are listening now, I'll just tell you, what is controlled remote viewing? Well, we're just given a number, gang, a number. I did my homework for Paul Smith's class last night. We're just given an 8-digit number. That's it. That's all we know about the target. And an hour later, my wife and I have a perfect drawing of Devil's Tower and a perfect description of Devil's Tower. And then sure enough, we get our homework, target back, and sure enough, it's Devil's Tower. Well, I mean, that's not, think about it, there's, a million potential targets in the world. It could have been a waterfall, it could have been a jet plane, it could have been anything. So if we're able to do that, to me, then you got to give up your skepticism at some point. Then you've got to say, hey, wait a minute, okay, all righty, then there is some sort of universal mind that we're contacting. And what do they say with the near-death experience? One of the most beautiful near-death experiences that I know of is this woman, and she describes very vividly, she almost died during when she was giving birth, and she describes the experience of losing the universal knowledge. She said, I wept, I cried, because I suddenly realized that everything that I had learned, everything I knew, I was losing it. And when I got back in my body, I wondered who was born. Was it me or was it the baby? Because I felt I had to start all over again. So so that's what. So controlled remote viewing, it's not the near-death experience. It's not. But what it is to me is it's hard evidence that what you experienced during the near-death experience is real. It's a window into the near-death experience.
Okay,
but we're just coming out with information about Devil's Tower. We're not. Well, we've done some interesting. Well, here I'll just just tell you, I had the Denver Remote Viewing Club. Again, we just give them a number. That's all they get. They get a number, and they accurately remote viewed Crystal Merzlock's near-death experience. The girl that I first studied. They detail for detail, blow for blow. They described exactly what happened to her, and that to me was unusual because giving somebody a near-death experience for a remote viewing target is I've never even heard of that before. So, and yet that's what they came up with.
So what you're saying is that you're actually I was a little confused. So when you're comparing the two, you're comparing the fact that you are able to reach almost a God state realm of consciousness of all knowing, not necessarily the all-encompassing warmth and love feeling.
Correct. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
You've nailed it. Yeah, that's exactly it. You enter into this state, but it's not. With remote viewing, you're fully conscious, and you're not right. There's not angels there. It's not. We're not dead. We're just. It's now. My associates, we're working on, as I told you, on medical applications, so we're all learning to remote view. My associates have gotten to the point where they can leave their physical body and explore, other realms. But again,
wow.
It's nothing like the near-death experience, though. We remote viewed. We're all. These are all just training targets to learn what we're doing. And my associate remote viewed the Hindenburg, he went all over the Hindenburg. He sort of, he got so deep into the experience that he detached from this physical reality. And it was so astonishing to him that he spent the last 3 or 4 weeks just poring over old records of the Hindenburg and of those airships, and just realizing to his amazement that he actually had been all kinds of stuff that people always wonder, is this, are these little chance fragments of memory in our mind, etc. But, none of us, know how the Hindenburg actually attached to its mooring posts or, what the internal workings are like or anything like that. And, so we have achieved that state, but still, that's a far cry from the near-death experience. And the near-death experience, is this, being, just
let me ask you
of love. Yeah.
Let me ask you, when you're talking about the remote viewing and you're assimilating, I guess wonderful, actually getting people to study but beyond looking at the Hindenburg, they're actually doing the medical stuff or gearing toward that direction. But that gives pause to one of these questions is, where does reincarnation fit into this? Are we reborn several times over, or are we just born once? I think that we really have a whole new understanding of reincarnation now. I never understood reincarnation before. To me, reincarnation used to be nonsensical. Because if you're born, well, then how could there's no DNA coming from the other person's, the person that you were is not coming to your new body. So, I always, but once we understand that consciousness is forever, that consciousness comes first, well, then you're just going through brain after brain after brain. That's a good description.
It's a different way of looking at it. We're here to learn lessons of love. That to me is a scientific statement. I'm not ashamed of saying it because I'm not a spiritual person, but it's just there's no doubt about it. And we're here. Our consciousness is meant to be in this physical reality, and our brain is sort of the vehicle, is the filter, if you will, that allows us to interact in this reality. And that's why people that have had near-death experiences are not all that interested in leaving their body. They're not interested in remote viewing. They're interested in, they know they're supposed to be right here. They're supposed to be, that's why we're in this consciousness. And
so you would say the brain is actually the physical. It's almost the antenna for the mind to break into the physical realm. Then.
Yeah, perfectly said. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And this is not, you asked me earlier before, you said, how much of my thinking has evolved. My thinking has evolved, obviously light years from when I trained at Johns Hopkins, but medicine is in fact coming to this point of view as well. And there's a guy, his name is Robert Lanza, and he's arguably one of the world's smartest physicians. He's done most of the cloning studies and cloning research, and it's Lanza if people want to look him up. Robert Lanza has also come to the same conclusion, and I was reading his website about a few months ago, and he talks about that the brain reboots consciousness. That when we get a new brain, we just sort of reboot our consciousness again. But that's kind of a good way to look at it. I mean, that's not a bad way to look at it at all.
No, it's not at all.
And we just sort of go through brain after brain after brain. I don't see. You can't really hear. Okay, let me just because your question was about reincarnation, but people, the reincarnation sounds like a religious belief. It's not anymore. Reincarnation to me is a scientific concept, but you have to then understand the science and how it would apply. So here's, the hottest thing in neuroscience right now is something called functional neurogenesis. So functional just means it has to do with the way we as human beings, function, interact, and neurogenesis means the growing of new brain cells. Well, it turns out in the last 10 years that the brain grows new brain cells in response to our experiences. And in fact, stroke victims, they can lose huge hunks of their brain, and yet they can regrow normal brain cells. Well, the only way that could happen would be if there was some source of consciousness and some source of, the underlying pattern existing outside of the functional brain. I mean, but, if you got a neuroscientist on your show, you would have to be pretty pointed with him or her. You'd have to ask them the right questions. They themselves are not quite ready to acknowledge this. But nevertheless, I don't know what's wrong with them. Theoretical physicists, they're all writing books on the philosophy of quantum physics. But we're not seeing that yet from the neuroscientists.
No. There actually, we had a psychiatrist who was into neuroscience studies. She was a neuroscientist, Diane Hennessy Powell, that wrote a book called The ESP Enigma. We had her on. I don't know if you've ever studied her work.
No, I want to get that book. It's called The ESP Enigma? I'm right.
Diane Hennessy Powell, yes. She came on our show and really kind of blew me away because of what you're saying right now is that there are so few of them out there that are investigating it, yet she did and is doing it. So let me ask you two questions. One, some people report not seeing, the near-death experience occurs, they come back and they say nothing happened. What is that? Is that just they don't remember, they don't want to?
Well, we looked at that issue very systematically. Most of it is because they were given medications that caused them to forget the experience. That's one of the reasons that we have such a high percentage of near-death experiences in our children we studied. In our formal study, we studied 26 children, and 24 of them had, reported a near-death experience. But these types of amnestic drugs, high doses of, basically, Valium-like drugs, are typically not used in children. Whereas in adults, they're just routinely given, as part of the resuscitative process.
Wow.
It's just, it's mostly just habit. It's not, nobody's sitting there saying, I want to suppress their near-death experience because most physicians don't think they're having
I was about to ask you that.
But no, it's more just that It's extremely painful to be intubated and mechanically ventilated. There's many cases of patients, who are in the operating room and they weren't given heavy enough of these doses, and so they had the horrifying experience of being awake, during their entire operation. So just as a result of that sort of thing, it's just sort of a reflex with, particularly with anesthesiologists. They're going to give high doses of these medicines. And we showed very nicely that, the fewer drugs that patients have on board, the more likely they are to have, these types of experiences. So I think that's the first thing, is they just forget it. I think the second thing is that the experience itself unfolds in a very systematic way. So, for example, we looked at the length of cardiac arrest versus the actual nature of the experience. So patients that had these very long, evolved, down the tunnel into a light, had experiences in heaven. They were often, anywhere from 18 to 45 minutes in which they were, being resuscitated. Whereas many patients have just a very brief cardiac arrest, just 1 or 2 seconds. And so they may just have complete darkness, which is the cessation of, the ordinary perception. They may be conscious, but just have darkness. And by and large, then they don't think they had any experience. And,
now,
that's, well, you asked me to tell you stories. I got to tell you
you're
stories.
You're doing a great job of it.
Because there's another part to this. When I hear people tell me that they haven't had a near-death experience, very often it's because they don't realize that what happened to them was a near-death experience. Because, see, we've all gotten sort of conditioned to think, it's floating out of the body, down the tunnel, and into the light. Well, Raymond Moody, who sort of, popularized that concept, if you read his book, he says that this is just a hypothetical construct, that he never actually met one patient that had that whole sequence. So I'm going to tell you a story. I was on a radio show just like this, and the host told me, he said, well, I nearly died, and I didn't have a near-death experience, so how do you explain that? So I said to him, well, tell me what happened, And, I want to hear the whole story because, sometimes people overlook little elements that, might tell us. So he says, well, I was in a car, and we were asleep in the back, and my friend was in the front seat, and he was drunk, and he was driving too fast. And he says, and so I suddenly saw that he was driving like 70, 80, and then, I saw the speedometer just going, 90 miles an hour. And he said, and that's really all I remember. And I said to him, wait a minute. Okay, so you were in the back of the car. You just told me you were in the back of the car and you were asleep and you were lying back there, and now you're suddenly saying that you saw the speedometer and you saw how fast the car was going? And right then he goes, oh my God, you're right. I was out of my body. It's just a lot of times people just don't, and then all kinds of other, memories just flooded right in. But it's just, you just have to keep that in mind. That, it's like a little child once told me that her near-death experiences was these doctors talking to her. And I said, well, how did you know they were doctors? She said they were 14 feet tall and they had light bulbs in their bodies. Well, if I hadn't asked her, what was a doctor, that could have just sort of been, so she didn't have an experience, just doctors were talking to her. So, there's a lot to it. When I hear people say they, and then also, how, the ordinary person, I don't think they really know if they're near death or not. I mean, the average, well, when I worked in the ICU, here's what our watchword was. The patient that we think is the healthiest is the patient most likely to die tonight. And the patient that's most critically ill is the patient that will probably still be here tomorrow. Because it's very hard to sort all that out, I mean, that's why I was telling you before, I'm so grateful. I have such an obligation that these are patients I resuscitated myself. I personally know what their state of their medical condition was. you can't get that from reading a chart.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that's my answer to that.
Tell me about I've read. I talked to Paul Smith and I've talked to Diane Hennessy Powell, and they're saying the pineal gland is the God spot, but I didn't really read that you were saying it's only the pineal gland, and I also know that one of your colleagues that you disagree with but have somewhat been receptive to his work is, I believe, a Dr. Beauregard. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain to us, potentially even walk us through where to put our hand on our head so we can know where the God spot is and what it is exactly?
Sure. Okay. I can't comment on what Dr. Powell had to say. But I wish she was on the show so I could talk to her. But anyway, let's. But Paul Smith is, he's a great guy, but he's an Army sergeant. I mean, he's not, he's got a PhD in philosophy. But anyway, the pineal gland throughout the ages has always been sort of mystically thought to have something to do with the seat of our soul. So, if you read, the ancient, anatomists and philosophers and, I think there's good reason for that, is that it's located it's above the brainstem, which is, right above, the neck, and it's sort of a nice round little shape. And so I think, people just sort of assume that, that's sort of the seat of the soul. And, there are interesting things about the pineal gland. The pineal gland has a lot of magnetic properties. There's some interesting work on spirit possession and things like that involve the pineal gland. But really, for the purposes of your question, I think the pineal gland, it really has nothing to do with being the God spot. I mean, to be blunt.
Wow.
That's just sort of picking up on, throughout history, and but not, but with the dawn of medical history, going back over 100 years, when people actually tried to figure out, hey, what does this brain do, and how does it work? It's been noted that the right side of the brain, in the deepest areas, so if you can imagine just right where your ear is, and then just, in about, 3 inches or so, in the very deepest area, is called your hippocampus and your temporal lobe. And it's on the right-hand side. And there's an important reason for that. We've now learned that we have 2 states of consciousness, one roughly corresponding to the right hemisphere and one roughly corresponding to the left hemisphere. And so this right temporal lobe has been, for a long, long time, about 100 years, associated with spiritual experiences in a wide variety of different ways. It's been noted that people who have seizures of that area have seizures of seeing God. Well, so if you have a seizure in your motor cortex, if you have a seizure, in the area that makes your leg move, well, then your leg will move all the time. Mm-hmm. So if you have a seizure in your right temporal lobe, then you'll have this repeated experience of seeing God. So that's, I think, Dostoevsky was, the Russian writer, had right temporal lobe seizures and frequently saw God. Alrighty, so then coming up to about in the 1940s and 1950s, Wilder Penfield, who's the father of modern neurosurgery, he actually took probes and he electrically stimulated the brain in the good old days of surgery when you didn't need informed consent and
just
and
do
these
it.
nosy human subject review committees. So he mapped out most of what we know about the brain, at least up until modern times. I mean, current modern times. He would, so he stimulate, your arm moving area of the brain, and the person would move their arm. He stimulated the leg, and so he mapped out all the different areas of the brain. And when he stimulated these areas in the hippocampus and in the right temporal lobe, people said stuff like, "Oh God, I'm leaving my body," Or they would say,
wow.
even more fascinating, I'm half in and I'm half out. So that's really where the situation comes right on up to modern times. So since I learned about near-death experiences and and this sort of thing, my only contribution to this was to just make the suggestion, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't a hallucination. Maybe this isn't, maybe they're actually contacting a real God. I mean, why not? I mean, for the first 100 years of this sort of research, everybody just sort of dismissed it. But it didn't ever make sense to me because why would, 25% of our brain be dedicated to allowing us to perceive a God, whatever God is? And this debate still continues to this modern day. So Andrew Newberg, for example, has done very nice studies of meditating nuns and such as that, and he's shown beautifully that there's a specific area of the brain that turns off when you meditate, and then other areas of the brain activate, and then ultimately the right temporal lobe, is activated, and people see God. Well, that's the same sequence of events that happens with a near-death experience. First there's the complete cessation of input from our ordinary senses, and then, then you're seeing God. But even today, if you read Andrew Newberg's work or if you read reviews of his work, people are still going, well, but see, if there's all this, hardware in the brain that allows us to see God, then doesn't that mean that this experience is just in your head? That they're not seeing a real God. And also, I propose this concept of the God spot. Dr. Beauregard, I have the greatest respect for him, but Dr. Beauregard sort of forgets that I proposed this idea almost 20 years ago. And so at the time that I proposed it, everybody else was saying, this is just a hallucination. And so I'm stepping forward, I'm saying, hey, wait a minute. No, it's not a hallucination. We have a God spot. It allows us to connect to a God. Because Dr. Beauregard, his objection is that I didn't go far enough. He says, wait a minute, it's not just a spot, but that in fact, there's multiple areas of the brain that allow us to have the spiritual experience. And so, when he says there's no God spot, that's what he's trying to say. He's trying to say it's not just a God spot, but that it's a larger, more generalized phenomena that we have. In fact, he calls his book the spiritual brain, that our brain itself is rigged to interact with God. I mean, whatever. I'm not. I don't want to pretend. I don't want to get into what God is. I had somebody angrily tell me, I don't believe in God. I believe in a higher power. To me,
okay.
God is what children tell me. Right? Yeah, they say they saw God, and I say, what is God? Well, he had a happy face for me. I don't want to get into a lot, but you see what I'm saying. So, we're sort of at a weird, I'm trying to do something a little bit different in that I'm trying to change the mass cultural point of view. So when I say there's a God spot, I'm talking to people who, like people like Matthew Alpert or people like Michael Shermer, who go, oh, look, there's a God spot. See, that proves that it's just in your brain. As if, that's what they're saying, and I'm saying no. If we come across a TV set, there must be a TV transmitter somewhere.
You've got, I read one of your accounts where the little girl, when you brought her back, she said that she was told to come back to help her mom with her brother. I mean, that right there, if you know the story I'm talking about, because that there proves that there's precognition, that it's beyond just the mind. Will you tell us that story? Oh, yeah.
And then she draws a picture. And her picture is of her brother with a gigantic heart in his chest. She draws a picture, she's in the sort of heavenly realm, and she says, I brought back to help my brother. And then she draws a picture, and he has a, and she, these are these very schematic pictures that children draw, but she draws this gigantic red heart in his chest. And sure enough, he was born with, a heart defect that caused his heart to almost fill his entire chest. And, of course, at the time that she was resuscitated, it wasn't even known that, that the mother was pregnant. And even if, let's say, somebody did have an inkling that the mom was pregnant, who could possibly have predicted that the child would be, born with a heart disease? That's how, coincidence. Coincidences are the refuge of the lazy mind. They're not, they're often used to explain these types of experiences. But come on, that's not a coincidence. It's, she actually saw something that was real. And there's, just case after case after case of that. That they're getting real information from this. They're experiencing something that's real. So our God spot connects us, to this greater reality, and it makes sense because if you have the concept of a God spot, well, then you can understand. Then what else do we use this? Well, it's used during prayer, during our ordinary lives. It's during it mediates spiritual experiences. I mean, over 50% of grieving parents will have a very vivid spiritual experience of their child returning to them, and trying to reassure them. And like I said, that's been my greatest motivation, is to try to sort out for them, is that just a byproduct of their grieving mind? Well, if we have a God spot, if we have 25% of our brain dedicated to have spiritual experiences, it's hard to see how we would have evolved that, just to give us a hallucinatory experience. But so that's, so I hope that explains, why, it's not just Mario Beauregard. I've got another good friend. His name is Julio Perez, and he also is very, he just, is very, if anything, my work upsets him, because it's not a God spot. It's the whole brain. It's the whole brain. When you say it's a God spot, you're trivializing it. Well, I don't know. Our levels of understanding have to proceed, and I think that the whole brain is that's a more advanced concept. But I think most people relate to the idea that we have a God spot that allows us to connect to a greater reality, and that's what we're doing when we pray, when we have spiritual visions, when we meditate, and we're going to all have the experience when we die.
Do in these near-death experiences, the people that come back, do they report seeing relatives, or are they angels? Do they have experiences where they don't report anyone? But I guess they have all of that. But is it common for a deceased relative to greet them?
Oh, absolutely. So the greeter is one of the most important parts of it, and that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. That when we die, somebody helps us with the transition. We don't die alone. We don't. Somebody helps us with this transition, and whatever this comes, it comes in a form that we can understand. So that's why you've got to you just got to buck up and start understanding that these experiences are real. Because one of the confusing things that people have is they go, well, how come this person said they had this experience and that person said they had that experience? Doesn't that just mean that the mind is just making it up? No, it doesn't. It means that we all understand spiritual experiences in a way, that we can relate to it. That, if my wife dies before me, I am certain that I will see my wife when I die. But you're not going to see my wife when you die. You're going to see, something that's important to you. And we show this very nicely. That could be, actually. I was just about to say, in children, it's very common for them to see dogs. It's very common for children to see dogs. Very common for them. One child told me that she saw a lamb, and she was told, I asked, well, what is this lamb? And she had a lammy when she was 2 years old. That was her comfort object. The experience itself is so vividly real that one girl said to me, she said, well, nobody was there when I nearly died, but one of your nurses sat by me. One of the nurses sat by me and held my hand while you guys were, while we were doing the resuscitation. I said, oh, that's really interesting. And she said, oh, yeah, it was so nice of her. She said, she just sat there and she just held my hand and she just smiled and told me everything is going to be all right. And she was a teenage girl. And she sort of made it sound like this was some sort of pleasant, just sort of like probably a volunteer that the hospital had that, came up and held people's hands during their resuscitations.
That's beautiful.
But,
it really is beautiful.
There's nobody there like that, right? So it's just, but the fact that there's so many different, since it comes to people in so many different ways, you got to go back to that initial understanding. Hey, wait a minute, we shouldn't be having any experience at all. That's why the first research that I did was, when does the experience occur? If the experience is just an invention of the mind after the fact, well, then of course, we're just inventing stuff that makes us feel good. But in fact, the near-death experience occurs in the last few minutes of life. And so, once you understand that fact, once you completely comprehend that, well, then you understand why, we went to Africa, we studied 50 African near-death experiences. They're nothing at all like American experiences, except they're conscious, they're aware, and they're learning lessons of love in the last few minutes of life. I didn't go. I sent my research assistant to Japan. She studied 400 Japanese near-death experiences. The exact same thing. The imagery was completely different, but awake, aware, and learning lessons of love.
Let me ask you this question.
And it's going to come to you away. Well, yeah, go on. I'm sorry.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I just had that one little fragment. I was just going to say that, we die the life we live, that it's going to come to you in a way you can understand. We don't die alone. We die with someone who helps us with the transition.
Okay, my question that I was going to ask you just left. Do you do any work with hospice?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Wow.
Hospice work to me is extremely important because this.
I would find you comforting.
Implications. Oh, thank you. That's there's, here's, since you say that, I get a million letters, but nowadays I get email, but back in the day some people wrote letters. I got so many letters, and here's a common pattern to these letters that really just meant a lot to me. Is a lot of times people would say, they'd say, something, I'm not sure that I believe in heaven, and I understand your research doesn't prove there's an afterlife, because I'm not. It really doesn't. I mean, it's not. It sort of tangentially does, but but they would say, but you told me, you let me see that my child's last few minutes of life were not painful. That, when I saw you, doing all those terrible things and sticking all those needles and, all the terrible things that you're doing, and that when my son looked at me and he said, Mommy, the white horse is here. Now I know what that meant, that wasn't just some sort of stray hallucination. That wasn't just some sort of mental fragment that, that I'm now assigning meaning to, but I now know, that, in our religion, the white horse, means that he's going to be going to God. And, now, thank you for letting me know what that means. And that means a lot to me because I think that's the most, it's all solid, but that's, very, I don't see any way of getting around it. That's, the rock hard core reality of the near-death experience is we're awake, we're aware when we die, and the dying process is pleasant. It's, well, I'm not looking forward to it, but, it's certainly not to be feared.
It's inevitable, though, so.
Yeah. There's no getting around it. We're all going to die, but, and just anybody who's listening has a fear of death, though. I have to tell you, what Jessie Lott told me. I said to her, because we did this follow-up study. I said, so are you afraid of dying? She said, oh no. She said, now I know a little bit more about it.
Wow.
So it's I don't see this. I'm not afraid to die, but of course I've had the experience of children patting me on the hand and saying, "Don't worry, Dr. Morse, heaven is fun."
That's incredible.
That sort of takes away, a
little bit of an edge.
You asked me at the start of this show. You were asking me, well, I mean, you can see it's just sort of easy. It's like water on the rocks. I started off just sort of come on, when you die, you die. I definitely was the callous emergency room, critical care physician you're talking about. And, after a while, you just, when they pat you on the wrist, because, I mean, she was seeing that part of me. She was seeing me like, sort of almost giggling at, what she's telling me. And she's like, oh, you'll see, Dr. Morse, heaven is fun. Don't you worry. It's you can't help but be moved by it.
Mm-hmm. Now, have there ever been any kind of studies where, and I know this would be few and far between, but one of our forum members wants to know, his name is Nemesis 2012. His question basically is, when you're dying and you start gaining access to this all-encompassing consciousness or the God spot, has anyone ever monitored the brain on the whole to see if everything is lighting up, with that consciousness coming in or becoming more apparent? Has there been any tests or studies done on the actual view or the actual presentation of the brain information at that point in time?
I'm going to learn more about that, because apparently that research has just come out this year, and I have not seen the research myself. This will be my way of bragging to you, to just slip in a little plug for myself.
All right.
We did a study of remote viewing, in which we wanted to see, could we successfully remote view viruses in plants. And we did that for a very important reason. The virus that we were attempting to remote view is virtually identical to the human AIDS virus. And so, we felt, but we thought we would see if we could, and our viewers can, to a highly, we're not good enough yet that we could use it clinically. I have one viewer who's about 90% accurate. The other viewers are in the 60 to 70% range, but nevertheless, highly statistically significant, because by chance, they're going to be 50% accurate. And we have thousands of trials. I mean, we have thousands of trials now. And so our research has been accepted for presentation in the International Consciousness Conference in Sweden, which is, arguably the top consciousness conference in the world each year. And at that, I just was looking through, who else was presenting there. And I briefly mentioned this earlier. There is a group that's going to be presenting their research, just what the caller's question was, that apparently there is some very coherent brain activity right at the point of death. But I honestly don't know any more than it. I'm not aware that they've published, and I'm just, I'm really anxious to hear what they have to say. Because think about it, we don't really, dying patients. I mean, it might, I well understand the person's question, but you got to understand the realities of the modern hospital. I can't even imagine how you could get something through a human subjects review board. Let's see. I want to do brain scans on dying patients. That's going to be. I mean, that's going to just be, just a no-go. I'm really fascinated to see that part of it. I mean, that's why we remote viewed viruses in plants, because we knew we've got to build up a pretty solid framework before we could even approach a human subjects review board. And this is just for remote viewing people. I mean, that's, nobody's going to argue that hurts anybody in any way. But doing research in hospitals on human subjects is very, very difficult. Unless you're a big drug company and you have another yet the 10th version of an antidepressant pill.
That's so true. Okay,
well,
we're down
to.
Wait.
I gotta get this off my chest because we talked about this we talked about this at the beginning of the show. So I want people to understand. I went through a lot of information in a quick way, but you're going to see we keep coming back to it again and again. You asked me, how does this change my view of medicine? Well, if the lessons that we learned from the near-death experience, if that was a pill, we would be selling them by the truckload. That would be, you look at the top 10 medications prescribed worldwide, over half of them are antidepressants, anti-anxiety. They're for mental states of mind. Mm-hmm. And yet the near-death experience clearly teaches us that we don't have to be afraid of dying, that our lives are filled with purpose and meaning. Serotonin uptake inhibitors, serotonin is sort of our molecule of meaning. That's why, so people wouldn't have to take a pill to have a sense of meaning. And yet, nobody, that's not controversial, that the top 6-7 drugs prescribed worldwide are drugs designed to relieve anxiety and promote meaning. And yet, the near-death experience, I once, tried to apply for a grant and for permission to just study and talk about spirituality with dying patients. And you would have thought that, I took a dump, on the front lawn of the hospital. So it's just infuriating that we
absolutely.
So trivialize the spirit, and yet we're so willing to prescribe a medication for people who don't feel spiritually connected. Okay, well, I won't let you talk about spirituality, but here, take a pill, and you won't find that you're worried about it anymore. Mm-hmm. Come on. This is, it's a far cry. I agree. It's a far cry from being a critical care physician. I used to my life was, can I thread a tiny little, catheter into a teeny tiny little vein? I lived for that. That was, wow, what could be better in life than that? Well, sure, I guess I'm a little different now.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, we're down to 3 minutes left. I had some questions I want to ask you, but we didn't get to them, and so that begs the biggest question of all. I want you back on the show in the near future. So
sure, I'd be happy to. This is
beautiful.
What a great conversation this has been. This is one of the best interviews I've had.
I didn't get through half of my questions because they were. Yeah, we're going to have you on in the near future. Will you go ahead and you told us what you're kind of working on. Will you plug your sites, plug your books? We only have 2 minutes left. And tell us, if you can, how to get involved.
Charity. Listen up, everybody. If
Please.
I did anything for you guys, if you learned anything, go to firstgiving.com. It's for the Special Olympics. Just put in my name is Melvin Morse, and it's it's one of these charity sites. It's for the Special Olympics. That's what I've got a fundraiser right now to raise money for the Special Olympics.
It's a pleasure to talk with you. I was going over your websites today, and you've got some phenomenal research and investigations into near-death experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in this?
Sure. I was a critical care physician for the first part of my career, and I was out of Seattle Children's Hospital. I worked for what's known as Airlift Northwest, and Airlift Northwest is, as you might imagine, is an air transport service through Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and to bring critically ill children to Seattle Children's Hospital. So I happened to pick up a young girl in Pocatello, Idaho, and she was a very, very difficult resuscitation. Several times I thought that she was, in fact, dead. And here, her parents, in fact, had insisted on coming in and praying at her bedside and forming sort of a prayer ring around her, which was very inconvenient for us because, of course, we're trying to put all kinds of tubes and lines in her. But I figured that she was, really, her demise was going to be within minutes, so I let them. But to my surprise, she made a full recovery. And as one of these things happens in life, sort of a coincidence, I happened to be out there in Pocatello working, doing some residency training in a little clinic there. And she happened to be, she came into that clinic for her follow-up after her successful recovery. And she looks at me and she goes, "Oh, there's the guy that put a tube in my nose."
Wow.
I was like, well, what? Because when I had seen her, of course, she wasn't seeing anything. Her eyes were fixed and dilated, and she was, well, we tape our eyes closed anyway in those situations because we don't want, dust or dirt to fall in them. But, I knew that she had not, in fact, seen me do anything. And she went on to say things like, little comments that the nurses has made. And then she said, I saw you go over to the phone, and you were talking to someone on the phone, and you were sort of shouting at them, saying, well, what am I supposed to do now? Which, in fact, was what I was doing, because I sort of, I didn't know, what to do next in terms of her resuscitation. And she gave a blow-by-blow details of her own resuscitation. And at the time, I was training to be a neurologist. And interestingly enough, medical scientists, we don't feel good about it, but let's face it, these are dead brains, and yet they're still conscious, and they're awake, and they're alert, and they're having thoughts and feelings. And more importantly, the feelings they're having are primarily spiritual feelings and the belief that they're learning lessons of love. You can't get around it. That's a scientific statement in the year 2011, is that when we die, we're going to be awake and aware, and we're learning lessons of love.
That's amazing.
Let me just, I'm going to just give you, to show you how solid this science is. There's a guy named Jim Winery, who is a very good friend of mine. I worked with him for years, and he's a flight surgeon for the National Warfare Institute. And he inadvertently discovered an experimental model for near-death experiences. They took fighter pilots, and they would put them in a centrifuge and whirl them at enormous speeds so they could understand the effect of G-forces on the human brain. And so, of course, he's able to, they can vary their centrifuge runs to, a couple of minutes before theoretical death, right on up to a couple of seconds before theoretical death. And sure enough, his research shows that in the last few seconds of life, really when the brain theoretically should be shutting down, it's not. It's those pilots then suddenly become awake and aware, and they think they're out of their body, and they're having a whole variety of near-death experiences. And quite frankly, This is after they've gone into coma. This is after they've had seizures. This is after they've had, a complete loss of, I mean,
amazing.
You can't. I don't think anybody can dispute anymore that in the last few minutes of life, a child told me best. She said, I was never so alive as in the few seconds before I died.
That's incredible. Let me ask you, your perception of Western medicine. I'm reading your work. You seem like you've moved away from the traditional constructs of Western medicine. Is that the case, or is Western medicine moving towards the research you're doing?
No, I think that I'm moving away from from traditional Western medicine. I want to say something though that I think is important. In no way am I saying that so-called Western medicine is wrong. I think that the new understandings that I've had, and frankly, I think anybody involved in this field has had. We're not.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I mean, but I understand this sort of skeptical viewpoint, or people that really dismiss these experiences out of hand, or really, that it doesn't resonate with them. Because I had that myself. I mean, it's very, very difficult, because we're trained, of course, to think that the brain creates consciousness. And I think one advantage that I have, these are by and large patients I resuscitated myself. So I knew for a fact that their brains weren't working. Whereas, when other people, when you read about these stories, or, you just really wonder, well, were they really close to death? Or, are they just kind of exaggerating things? Or, or if you go through the medical records, it's very hard sometimes to tell if somebody's really near death or not. Whereas the boy I was telling you about, I know, he was in full cardiac arrest. Within minutes, he would have been dead. That's why we resuscitated him on the lobby of the, the children's hospital instead of taking him to the emergency room.
When you say they're dead, I guess a skeptic would say, oh, well, there must be some oxygen in the brain. There's still brain activity, but that's not the case. The brain is literally flatlined. Is that correct?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm going to just skip to the end of the story, because I just think that I used to mince around like you're saying too. When we first published our studies, we would call them clinically dead, and then we would we just sort of hem and haw about it, because again, it defies what we're taught. I went to Johns Hopkins. The gods of neurology that I worship say that, the coma wipes clean the slate of consciousness. Dead brains don't think, in other words. But here's the end of the story. I'll just skip right to the end. In the last couple of years, astonishingly enough, science has found that there is a resting energy in the brain that far exceeds probably the entire energy output of the brain, during conscious life. And so they're really, in the last couple of years, it's been well shown that the dying or dead brain has an enormous amount of resting activity. Physicians at George Washington University just recently showed that in the last few seconds of life, there's an enormous amount of coherent brain wave activity measured on EEGs. So I think we just, I don't think anybody feels good about it. Unless you're already very religious. But I'm just saying the spiritual aspects of her experience really had very little interest for me. I was mostly interested that she could remember anything, that she could in fact describe her own resuscitation. And
how many of these
results they study this?
You've documented many of these instances. Was it something that, when you encountered her story, did it immediately start ringing bells in your head that there's something else out there? Because I read a story of yours where you were talking about joking with other doctors as you were, I believe, performing CPR on a baby or trying to resuscitate a child. And it didn't shock me when I read that, because I've got family there in the medical field, and it's somewhat common that, I guess, to make a light of the situation or to make it easier to accept, that a lot of medical professionals end up almost in a very callous nature in regards to a situation like that. It wasn't just this one event. How many do you think overall, before you started going, wait a second, there's something here?
Well, it wasn't. I don't think that was really the sequence. I haven't really thought that there was something here, as you put it. That took me many, many years to reach that realization. What really interested me first was this concept of that she could retain a memory at all. And so I immediately, I was just starting in medicine. I was a resident at the time, so I was, I wanted to make my mark in the world, and I immediately set out to do a study of these experiences. And at the time, nobody had really studied these experiences in any sort of formal or systematic way. there was a number of sort of collections of stories in adults. But at Seattle Children's Hospital, we decided that we would, at the time, actually, we thought that an anesthetic agent called halothane caused these experiences. Halothane is known to sort of cause dissociative or out-of-body experiences, and we decided we would study them. So we studied all survivors of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital over about 10 years. And then it's over that 10-year period, I mean, that it just sort of starts creeping up on you. I resuscitated one child. He was resuscitated in the lobby of Seattle Children's Hospital. He had a cardiac arrest because his pacemaker failed. And so we resuscitated him right in the lobby and got his pacemaker going again. And he opens his eyes and he looks at me and he goes, "That was weird. You guys just sucked me back into my body." Saying, though, that, that pills don't work. Of course they work. Of course our bodies are biological machines. Of course we can tinker with the biological machine with, various pills and things like that. But having said that, it's far more limited than we ever realized. That so much of medicine is, in fact, what people loosely call energetic medicine. It's really, this idea that, that we're just a biological machine. It doesn't do justice to what's going on during the healing process.
I agree.
We're just, but it's not. The reason I'm emphasizing this is it really irritates me what I consider to be an unhealthy either-or attitude. Either you go see a naturopath or, you go see your regular doctor. I mean, I dream of, 20 years from now, all doctors having the same body of information and using it, the way it's supposed to be. I mean, medicine should be medicine.
I agree.
Sure, but having said that, I mean, we're doing a lot of research now in energetic medicine, and it's amazing to me that the sort of built-in prejudices against it, the built-in, this sort of the sweeping and the dismissive,
it's somewhat dismissed, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's ridiculous. Of course it's true. This might sound like a weird jump to you, but it's not. So I'll fill in the gaps, but I'm going to do the jump first. When I wanted to understand if the near-death experience is real, so one thing that my wife and I learned to do was something called remote viewing. And the remote viewing is the ability to use your mind to see things that are not in your ordinary field of senses. Well, so that's important to me to understand near-death experiences, because the near-death experience is what we call a non-local perception. These children are describing another reality that is not, in fact, this reality. Well, so the question comes, well, is that other reality real? Is the God that they see a real God? Well, and I've been on enough of these debates to know that, that you always have some sort of mean-spirited, materialist guy that only, it always does seem to be a guy, by the way. He always says, well, these are just hallucinations in the last few minutes of life and blah, blah, blah. Come on. So let's see, when we die, we hallucinate we're going to heaven, and we hallucinate we're learning beautiful stories of love, of how we could have lived our lives differently if